All right. Hey, everybody. Happy Sunday. I hope you guys are having a good holiday weekend so far. As a reminder, of course, tomorrow, Monday, is a market holiday, so we have another day to relax before the market opens. Hey, Benary, great to see you. Bearded Trader, howdy to you as well. Hope you guys are doing good. So let's talk a little bit about the market, what we might be able to anticipate going into next week, as well as talk about the trades that I put on for the $500 challenge now that we are starting a new month on Sunday. Hey, Peanut, great to see you. Happy Sunday to you as well. So overall with SPX, this is a chart pattern, of course, that we talked about last time. It's also something that I've posted on my Twitter, so certainly go check that out. It's a pinned post. This is a setup that we've seen quite a bit, certainly this year, where we've been trending below the 100 period simple. We get a chance to potentially break it and try and go into that bullish trend. It fails. We break back below the 100 period simple, which is this solid kind of like gold orange line on my chart. And then when we get a second chance to try and go back up and test it and it fails, that is usually a clue to look at going back short, whether it's just to play at least into the technicals, if not the lows going into the run up into the 100 period simple, or potentially right the all-time lows or of this year, if not the trend itself into new lows. So certainly we saw that back here, right? Not as strong of a break, arguably, but we did end up failing, right? We dropped below the 100, came back up, tested it, and then ultimately failed that to the downside. Here, more recently, right, Powell opened his mouth and said some things he's never said before. And in turn, the market did not like hearing that, and we dropped down on Friday of last week, the one prior to last, and we completely broke the 100 period simple. And then starting Monday of this past week, we haven't been able to break above it. We drifted a little bit lower, had a bounce back up Friday into that range to test it, right? Didn't I would argue didn't even quite come close to it. We tried to hold 4,000, but ultimately failed that level in the intraday charts right around the lunch hour, surprisingly. Usually when things are a bit more quiet and choppy, it just completely fell down. And then we made actually a very nice bearish signal, a bearish divergent bar off the 100 period simple with bearish sentiment on momentum now that it's crossed below the zero line. Plenty of room to continue to the downside for a potential bearish trend, right? Like we saw back there, back there. And we have a great bearish signal that, of course, has been printing for a while now on the compound breakout tool with Bollinger Bands opening to the downside. So they're already anticipating that potential move lower. Hey, Lisa, great to see ya. Sorry about the ads. I do apologize about that. I'll try and get these downloaded so they're posted on the YouTube channel as well. So maybe that will help a bit with the ads, right? Um, but as we can see here, right, we're basically failing this level to try and move to the downside. So that's what I'm anticipating. Now, what I find interesting about this setup is, one, we do have back-to-back divergent bars, so that could be still a slight sign of chop. Two, of course, with the bearish divergent bar that we have here, it potentially, right, could mean that we see that lower low. I usually give it 3 bars to try and have it follow through within that time frame, and then it does. If it doesn't, right, I usually cut the trade idea from there. But what's interesting is one, it's a shortened trading week next week, right? So we don't have Monday like I talked about at the start, so it's just Tuesday through Friday. And if we were to give it the 3 bars to follow through, instead of that typically being on a Wednesday, it now lands on a Thursday, right? Because Tuesday is your next trading day, and then Wednesday, and then Thursday would be the 3rd bar. That'd be the last day I'd give it to follow through with a potential low. And correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I do believe Mr. Powell is opening his mouth prior to market open on Thursday. So, isn't that interesting how that lines up? I wouldn't be too surprised if next week we did try maybe for another bounce up towards the 100, right? It could be that we immediately follow through with the lower low, kind of like what we did here. But I wouldn't be too surprised if it did something like this and stalled maybe a bit longer, especially if some of the hedge funds, right, the bigger boys weren't able to jump in where they wanted to price-wise, I could see them trying to pump it back up at least towards that 4,000 range, if not maybe even towards the 40, 45, 40, 50 range into the 100 and to the 10, right, to potentially test that as resistance. And even if it traded above it for the day, as long as the open and the close are still below, right, at or below the 100 period simple, that to me means it's still holding resistance ultimately. And that would be a good sign to end up shorting. And if the pullback, right, happens Tuesday into Wednesday or something like that, setting up for that Thursday possibility, I will certainly be looking to play that to the downside myself. Now, keep in mind, one of the things that we've been doing in the Profit Recycling Mastery is we don't necessarily bet completely one way, because the only thing we can be certain of in this market is volatility, right? So I will more than likely, if I am playing something around Powell's speech, which I probably will, right? Because whenever he talks, he typically can move the market. At least he certainly has this year. So for that reason, I wouldn't mind doing something but playing it on both sides, right? That way, in case I am wrong and that volatile move happens to the upside, he's like, just kidding, guys, we're totally going to do rate cuts next year. I was just kidding, right? Whatever, walks it back. That in turn, of course, would cause the market to be a little bit more euphoric. And so I would certainly look to have a little bit of a hedge to the upside, but I am not anticipating that. Nothing on the indicators. I mean, arguably there's a true low here, but with the Bollinger Bands opening up, that already tells me to wait until they flatten out for some sort of retest, right? So for that reason, ultimately I'm looking to play it more to the downside myself, but I'll have that hedge just in case. Maybe if the cost makes sense, maybe we'll look to do something in the $500 challenge account itself. However, I do already have 2 trades that I'm in, so let's talk about those really quickly. The first one's Google. So, yeah, I cannot imagine. So, Michelle, first of all, great to have you on board. Certainly the $500 challenge trades I post here. So that does happen on Twitch as well, but obviously they're not all my trades. The majority of my trades I do in the Profit Recycling Mastery, which that does also have a trial on it if you wanted to check it out. But I'm in there most days going into market close, with the exception of Thursdays, usually like the last hour of market, and we walk through the trades that we hold, different setups, and ultimately we look for those SPX pin trades into the close for those 0-day expiration ones, if you're talking about those specifically. So Google is actually a setup that I've been talking about at Simpler as well as on Twitch and stuff. It's part of that pin setup where ultimately, right, we've come back up. We trended below the 100. We're coming back up to test it. We failed. Notice that we came up here to test it again and then failed on that Friday when Powell opened his mouth. And ultimately, the Bollinger Band started to flare open and everything looked weak. Now, arguably last week, for the most part, we did technically move lower, but it was chop, right? It was a lot of chop the majority of the time. But that can happen, of course, just like it does in bullish trend. Chop allows things to reset. As we can see here, the price, which was pressing against the lower Bollinger Bands, right, is now back at resistance levels of the 10 period simple, because the 10 period simple was able to catch up with where the price was trading, and it basically failed that on Friday, making a very nice bearish divergent bar. Bollinger Bands are still flaring open, so they're still trying to catch up and keep up with the price move and ideally keep it in the comfort zone, very much like it did back here, arguably. Momentum, of course, crossed below the 0 line and has plenty of room to continue to the downside. We do have some price levels that we want to be mindful of around here, right? Because that has been price support. And there is a monthly level at 103.21 that I want to be mindful of as well. But ultimately, right, if the market does really end up selling off, Google will likely go with it. And the thing that I find very interesting about Google is actually the weekly chart, where the weekly chart has started to turn bearish on the compound breakout tool, has a high compression squeeze that it's going into, came up once again into resistance levels and has failed them back lower. But the trend, if you notice here, is attempting to turn bearish. The 30 is getting ready to cross below the 100, and the 10 is already there. So if the 30 starts to cross below the 100, the trend technically is starting to turn bearish, right? Now, momentum's had a beautiful reset, so if we start to see red bars pick back up to the downside, there's plenty of room for that trend to continue lower technically. And the only thing that is of caution right now is we don't technically have that yet, right? And the Bollinger Bands, of course, are more in consolidation, which happens when you get a squeeze to print. So I want to be mindful of the price level here, because arguably we could still consolidate for a while before that goes. But like I said, if the market does really start to potentially sell off this week, especially around Thursday, if Powell speaks and it's whatever negative reaction the market wants to have to it, that in turn could bring the price down on Google. And certainly if we break this monthly support level that we're running into here, of course outside 100 as a psychological level as well, the next big technical support that at least I have, right, from a simple moving average standpoint and things like that, is all the way down here at 64. Now, I don't know if Google would sell off that far. I wouldn't mind buying shares that far down to the downside, right? But, right, that's a long ways lower. So I want to see how this, of course, starts to react into next week. But all of that to me looked like a pretty good setup. Even here, it looks like the 30 is getting ready to roll off the 100, just like it did back here. And that, of course, could lead to a nice potential bearish move, or at least, at the very least, right, a test of maybe these lows back here. So we'll see if that happens. The other trade that I am in the challenge, so this one I gave 2 weeks, right? I wanted to still keep it really cheap, so I got in the 101 put, which is pretty far out of the money, for 77 cents. The reason why I liked that, though, is because if this really starts to sell off and break 103, certainly if it can go down and test 103 next week, this should be profitable. But if it really starts to break that level, right, the next big range would be 100. That would put that strike $1 in the money. And I've given it a little bit of time to see if that can happen or not. The other trade I'm in is Netflix, and this one I gave until the end of September, and I jumped into a vertical spread. And for those of you in the mastery, as you guys know, we're already actually in this trade in a contract, and we're already profitable on the trade technically, but I doubled up in the challenge account because that's how much I like it, and that's how inexpensive the spread still is, even though on the mastery side of things, we're technically profitable and arguably paid a little bit more in the challenge account. But the reason why I like this trade, it's a 10-point spread. It is the 185, 175 put, and that seems rather far out of the money, right? We're at 226, and we are at a hurdle right now of support. So of course, ideally, we need to start to see these support levels break. Once again, if the market can't hold up, right, this is an inexpensive way to potentially play for a continuation and sell-off. And you're like, Allison, but why would you play Netflix, right? Why wouldn't you play something like Amazon or like you already did with Google? Why not double up in that? Because it seems a little bit more sensitive to the market than Netflix does at this point with how much it's consolidating here. But the reason why I like Netflix so much is because of a monthly signal that's been setting up. And so on the monthly chart, we have broken the 100-period simple, right? We went up and tested it recently and basically are holding it as resistance. Last month was a bearish divergent bar. That technically has already followed through the lower low, which isn't too surprising, right? We closed near the lows of last month. But we have a bearish divergent bar from 2 months ago that is still valid. That is down here at 164.28. And as you guys might recall from the start of this conversation, I usually give divergent bars 3 bars to follow through. I find 3 is the magic number for the indicator, right? If it hasn't followed through by the 3rd, every now and then it might be the 4th bar, but usually I just let it go at that point because more often than not, it's within the 3-bar time frame. And so that would mean, right, that by potentially the end of this month, we could see at least a move back down towards the lows that we've had, right? Now that doesn't mean we're breaking out of this overall consolidated range, but certainly a move back down to test it certainly wouldn't be out of the question, especially when we've come up, tested resistance for failing. Bollinger Bands are still opening up. And even though arguably we are at exhaustion levels, we've been adjusting the axis lower now for months. So until we get some green bars, this can keep picking to the downside. And this is still a very strong bearish signal. It has not canceled out at all yet. So even though we've gotten the true lows, because the Bollinger Bands are flaring open like they are, we technically wait. So that's the reason why I like the Netflix trade so much, arguably, because if we do get down to 164 range by the end of the month, that of course would put our 10-point spread, the 185, 175 strikes, right, nicely in the money and allow for a very nice risk versus reward there. So we still have some capital left to play with. I will, of course, see if we can get into an SPX pin trade. I don't know, those last 2 months haven't been working in the challenge account specifically for whatever reason on those pin trades. We've had some winners in the mastery, certainly in July, and we actually had a nice winner the other week in the mastery in August. But for whatever reason, the challenge account, they've been more on the day trade side. And as you guys know, I usually let those cash settle and try not to day trade them when I can. So we'll see. I'll attempt it again this month if it makes sense on the risk versus reward and setup. But otherwise, I'm glad to be kind of expanding more into some of these trend setups because these were things that I've been eyeing now since August. And that's why in the mastery, we're in some of these trade ideas already and, have been looking at profits versus I wanted to wait in the challenge account because I wanted to wait for us to start a new month in here because I try and reset the account each month. So now that it's in the month where I'm looking for these setups to start to happen and pick up, which is in September, we're able to play them. So I'm kind of excited for that. And yeah, so the divergent bar indicator are these different color bars. It's an indicator I have over at Simpler. But basically, if it's a pink bar, it's a bearish divergent bar, and a white bar is a bullish one. And I'm just looking for that lower, lower, higher, high within the next 3 bars. But that is my time, guys. I do need to go and get the kids down, so that is my market update. In short, right, I like the Netflix trade idea. We've given that the entire month for it to try and follow through with that lower low. The Google trade's a little bit more shorter dated, but we'll see if we can start to pick up some on the selling. Either way, though, for SPX in particular next week, I wouldn't be too surprised if it chopped a bit or if we went back up and tested the 100 earlier in the week, like Tuesday or Wednesday. But ultimately, well, either way, right, on Thursday, I certainly think it would be a good idea to play the volatility, right? So maybe set up something on both the call and put side to take advantage of a bigger trading day, if you will, because we know Powell's speaking Thursday before the market opens. But otherwise, personally, I think if as long as resistance maintains itself, I'd be looking to play this more to the downside overall. So we'll see if that happens or not. And then, of course, it could also just be that it happens at the start of the week, right? Where we get the immediate follow through of that lower low and the selling. I don't know if that's going to happen, right? I almost think we'll get a bit more chop and then Thursday will be the catalyst. But we'll see, right? We'll see what happens. So thank you so much, guys. As always, may the trade be with you, my fellow Jedis. And I look forward to talking to y'all again on Tuesday. And for those of you not over at Simpler or haven't checked out the Simpler free room yet, I will certainly be back here next Sunday. Have a good one, guys. Bye.